Good morning, everybody. It is still morning, isn't it? Yes, we've got another hour. Welcome to one of our concurrent sessions for day one of our conference. I'm Elise Phillips, Interim CEO at Domestic Violence New South Wales, and I would like to acknowledge that we are on Gadigal land of the Eora Nation. This land was never ceded, always was, always will be Aboriginal land, and of course we note the impact of colonisation on those communities. It's a pleasure to have you all here, and we're really privileged to have Emma Partridge from Our Watch joining us this morning. Emma has come all the way from Melbourne and we'll be sharing with us an overview of the second edition of Our Watch's Change the Story, a framework which I hope you may be familiar with, or at least of the first edition. It is our framework, our national framework for primary prevention of violence against women in Australia. And the revised, expanded and updated framework was released in late 2021 as a follow-up to the first edition back in 2015. Emma's presentation will outline the rationale and process for developing the second edition and will summarise its content with a focus on explaining what's new and what's changed in the second edition of what remains a world-leading national prevention framework. So it's something that we can be really proud of here in Australia. Our session will go till, we've got until 12 o'clock and there will be time for questions later in the session. So if you've got any burning questions, please take note of them, and there will be an opportunity to switch rooms for the next concurrent session ahead of lunch. So there'll be about 5 minutes for anyone who does want to shift. And I will talk to the next topics when Emma gets to the end of her presentation. So thank you all so much, and I'll hand over.
Thank you, Elise. Sorry, I didn't realise I was going to be juggling a mic and a clicker. It's all good. Thank you, Elise, for the introduction, and thank you everyone for having me. Before I start, I would like to also acknowledge that I am here on the Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, Gadigal peoples of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders past and present, and acknowledge that this is and always will be Aboriginal land. I'd also, as I'm visiting from Victoria, like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nations, on whose lands I usually have the pleasure of living and working. I also would like to, in that same spirit, acknowledge the particular impacts of violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women in this country, and that we and I and Our Watch certainly do not see violence against women as separate from the original impacts of colonial violence in this country, and how important it is to link those two areas of understanding in our work. Before I start, I also would like to acknowledge the decades of activism from the women's movement, and particularly the activism and advocacy of victim survivors to increasingly get this issue on the national agenda. I think Our Watch, as a relatively new organisation, always knows the length of work and the shoulders, other people's shoulders on whom we stand. So I like to always make a point of acknowledging that. Thank you, Elise, for the introduction. I am here to talk through the new edition of Change the Story, which we have recently produced. It's a little bit hard to pitch this because I never know how many people are familiar with the first edition and if I need to start from scratch, or how many people just want to know the updates. So I've tried to sort of hedge my bets. Forgive me for those of you who are very familiar with the first edition or the second edition. I'll do my best to straddle those two, and I'll leave some room at the end for questions if there are particular aspects that I haven't been able to cram into this presentation. So Change the Story, for those who are not familiar with it, it is our evidence-based framework for the national approach in Australia to preventing violence against women. So primary prevention, preventing violence before it happens. The first edition was produced as a partnership between Our Watch, which is the National Prevention Organisation, and Vic Health, which is the Victorian Health Promotion Foundation, and ANROS, which is our research body working on violence against women. So produced in 2015, and I think it's still the case that that was a groundbreaking, world-leading prevention framework. At the time, we couldn't find any other country in the world that had a national framework for primary prevention, focused on primary prevention. Many of them have frameworks that talk about preventing violence. When you open them up, they're actually about responding to violence and improving the responses to violence. all of which is, of course, critical, but it isn't preventing that violence from happening in the first place. It's still a world-leading document, and we're constantly getting inquiries from other countries about how they can adopt this kind of approach. So it's something we're very proud of. It's also something we feel a huge responsibility to keep up to date. That first framework happily was endorsed as the national framework under the Australia's first national plan to reduce violence against women, which means that under the now non-existent COAG, all of the state and territory governments signed up to that framework, to endorse that framework as the national framework. It also, of course, forms the foundation for all of Our Watch's work. So Our Watch does work in policy, in campaigns, in media. We do practice resources and tools for practitioners on the ground. We work with governments. Everything we do has Change the Story as the foundation, because that's our evidence base. So in writing a second edition, 5 years after the first one was produced, because we were conscious it was such a groundbreaking and innovative framework in the first place, part of the reason for that was that we wanted to go back and check that the conceptual framework was correct, review the more recent evidence, and update and expand that to really strengthen this national framework. So this is the second edition. Why did we produce a second edition? As I said, we wanted to update the evidence space. In 2015, we did a big review of the national and international evidence on prevention of violence against women and what drives that violence. We wanted to look at any literature that had come out in the last 5 years to see if there was anything new we could add, or if it changed anything that we had adopted in that explanatory model the first time around. It was, again, a chance to review and reflect on that explanatory model and how we had interpreted the literature and created a model that has drivers and reinforcing factors of violence and so on, which I'll talk about. We also wanted to respond to a lot of feedback that we'd had from users of the framework over the past 5 years. When we produced that first framework, Our Watch was tiny, still a baby, a handful of staff, like in single-digit numbers of staff, and so the framework was put together pretty quickly, and we have then expanded significantly, and a lot of people around the country have picked up that framework, used it, given us feedback, given us their perspectives, told us what they like, told us what they don't like, what they wanted to see more of. So we really wanted to kind of honour the feedback and the enthusiasm that we'd had over 5 years in the second edition. We knew that there were particular topics that we hadn't given sufficient space to, or we hadn't had time or chance or opportunity to properly explain, and we've been wanting to expand them for the last 5 years, so this was a great opportunity to do that. We also wanted to incorporate some of our own subsequent evidence, and I'll talk specifically, but since 2015, Our Watch has produced a number of other resources focused on particular topics, which I'll mention, and reviewed other areas of literature that we wanted to kind of bring in and integrate into the second edition to really bring it up to date with our own evidence base. So all of this, the objective of all of this second edition project was to ensure that Change the Story really does remain a robust and evidence-based framework, that it's current, that it's comprehensive, and that it's accessible and user-friendly to all of the diverse stakeholders that we aim it at. So I did just want to touch on how we developed the second edition, because we didn't just bunker down in a room and rewrite it. We did another systematic review of international and Australian evidence that has been produced since 2015. As I said, we also gathered together our own publications and drew out the key messages and key findings from those to integrate into the second edition. And we synthesised and summarised and analysed all of that evidence, because we didn't want to replicate all of those pieces. We wanted to integrate the key findings into the second edition. We then did a lot of stakeholder consultation, and some of you in this room I know were involved in some of this, a big stakeholder survey where we surveyed all sorts of practitioners, policymakers, researchers that had used the framework and asked them what they thought of it and how they thought it could be improved. We did a number of workshops with some of those key stakeholders, and also some technical expert workshops, which is sort of researchers and academics who work in this area who could really guide us to make sure the evidence was accurate and up to date. And then we also farmed the drafts out to some of those experts to give them a chance to review it and improve it. So we did a fairly systematic process in updating the second edition. And I'm here to talk about the changes in the second edition and what's new. But I guess before I do that, I wanted to emphasise that there is a strong degree of consistency between the first edition and the second. The evidence that we looked at didn't trigger major changes to our conceptual model, to the drivers, the reinforcing factors. All of that remains fairly intact, and there is a strong degree of consistency between the approach to prevention that we outline in the second edition and the first. So it certainly isn't throw it all out and start again, like far from it. Most of the recent evidence confirmed our approach and our conceptual model, and in fact provided even greater and more recent support and evidence for that, which was something of a relief. But we have made some changes to the second edition that strengthen it, clarify key points, and make it clearer and more comprehensive. So those are the kinds of changes I'm going to focus on today. One of the things we have changed in the second edition is to provide a clearer rationale for the way that Our Watch in particular talks about all forms of violence against women. And there's a lot of debate, as you would all know, in the field at the moment about whether we call this family violence, family and domestic violence, sexual violence, all of those, gendered violence. And all of those terms, of course, are absolutely legitimate and all have their place and can be used in context. Our Watch has a constitution which asks us to focus on violence against women, and so that's what we do. We also use the term gendered violence because, of course, violence against women is gendered, and because, of course, there are other forms of gendered violence that this overlaps with. So we include family violence, we include domestic violence, and we include sexual violence, but we take that United Nations human rights framework as our guide, which is that this is about all forms of violence against women, whether they occur in a family and domestic setting or whether they occur in a workplace as sexual harassment, or whether they occur on a train or in the street as street-based sexual harassment. And I think we feel quite strongly that in using family and domestic, there are a lot of other forms of violence against women that get deprioritised. So we're trying to take a really broad and inclusive approach to that. We've also this time been much clearer about including gendered violence against adolescent girls and young women in the scope of the framework because the research was really clear in showing us that it is actually young women who are at high risk of various forms of sexual violence and gendered violence, and that too often when we talk about domestic violence and family violence, people automatically imagine an adult woman in an adult relationship. And it's really clear that there is not enough focus and not enough work on the kinds of gendered violence, dating-related violence, sexual harassment, sexual assault that young women and adolescent women are experiencing, not because they're children, but because they're women. So we're really wanting to bring a greater focus to that aspect of violence against women. Another thing we've done in this edition is place a stronger focus on the need for systemic change and structural change. And I think those of you who are listening to Tanya a minute ago talking about the infrastructure that's being built in Victoria will see how important that is and how difficult it is to achieve change to prevent violence if you don't actually have policy change, systemic and structural change, funding support and government action that you can hang that work off. Too often we see a focus on individual change and changing individual attitudes and working with individuals, all of which is critical and important, but it will never create that population level structural and cultural change if we don't also work at those higher levels, particularly with governments. So we're trying to place a greater focus on that aspect. We've also in the second edition, and we did this in the first obviously, but I think we've really tried to strengthen it in this one, place a greater emphasis on men's perpetration of violence rather than women's experience of violence. And just to clarify, it's not to say that one is more significant than the other. When you're working in the response sector, of course, women's experiences and women's needs are front and centre, they're front of mind, they're the things that you respond to because you're there to support victim survivors. When you're working in primary prevention, right up the other end of the spectrum, you're actually trying to stop men from perpetrating violence in the first place. So you need to flip your mindset, your focus. You need to stop talking so much about women and violence and much more about men and masculinity and prevention and the drivers and the attitudes and the reasons why men sometimes perpetrate violence in the first place. So there's a real need to flip the discourse or the perspective that we take to this issue from a prevention perspective, not for everybody else working in the response sector, but for Our Watch. So we've focused a lot more on the role of harmful forms of masculinity in driving violence against women. And in doing that, we've been able to draw on one of the frameworks that I mentioned Our Watch has produced since the first edition, which is Men in Focus. And for those of you who have a particular interest in working with men, I'd suggest that document's really key. I've got a few copies of the summary here, and we've been able to integrate some of the key messages from that into the second edition, although, of course, it stands on its own as a really useful evidence review and guide to addressing masculinity. Similarly, Changing the Picture, we produced in 2018, which is our framework for preventing violence against First Nations women. And we did a lot of work there to unpack what are the additional drivers or the intersecting drivers of violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. And those women told us that, of course, all of those gendered drivers are relevant because Aboriginal women are women and they experience the same forms of, or similar forms of sexism and discrimination as anyone else. But that in addition and in intersection with that, they are experiencing the ongoing impacts of colonisation, the ongoing impacts of racism and racialised power inequalities. And they're also in experiencing sexism in a particular way because it's colonial patriarchy. So Changing the Picture, there's a much deeper analysis of those things that I've skated over there in Changing the Picture, which, again, I encourage people to read in its own right and in its entirety. But in the second edition of Change the Story, we've referenced it and we've tried to point to some of those key intersections there. We've also included, as I said, some additional topics or expanded topics that we didn't do justice to in the first edition. One of those is an explainer on both the use and the limitations of binary language. And obviously for an organisation that has a mandate to focus on violence against women, we need to address this issue because we know that sex and gender and sexuality are not binary, that those are constructions. It shouldn't even be necessary to state that anymore, but obviously that's the case. And we have now we now have this section which talks about how it is still legitimate to use binary terms because the world is organised in binary ways, and it is women and children, of course, who bear the brunt of men's violence. And that all of those UN human rights frameworks absolutely acknowledge that, and that's a legitimate and, in fact, really useful way of understanding gendered power dynamics and the experiences of women in this country. We make clear that obviously that includes transgender women, lesbian women and so on. It's not just cisgender heterosexual women, but that it is legitimate to use that framing. At the same time, we're really clear that there are significant limitations to a binary framework and a binary language. And so wherever possible, we should be looking to break down those that binary language and those binary frameworks and talking about people of all genders rather than talking about men and women. In other contexts, it's really useful and significant and legitimate to talk about men and women. So I think this trips a lot of people up, this issue, and people get completely kind of paralysed by it. And we did a lot of work with Rainbow Health actually in Victoria to help write this section, and I'm hoping it helps people navigate that debate. And we look forward to everybody's feedback on whether it does that or not. We also have provided much greater recognition in the second edition of the connections between this framework, which focuses on preventing violence against women, and the shared, overlapping but slightly different agenda of preventing violence against LGBTQI people. Particularly, we know that there are overlapping drivers of both forms of violence and that harmful forms of masculinity and rigid and hierarchical and binary notions of sex and gendered relationships are drivers of both of those forms of violence. So seeing these two things completely separately is not useful to anyone. We also know that the LGBTQI acronym, which everybody always stumbles over, includes a whole heap of women. So that violence against women sits under that umbrella. We also knew that both forms of violence, overwhelmingly violence against women, is perpetrated by men. What's also interesting and less well understood is that of people in the LGBTQI community who experience violence, 84% of them in the Australian data said that the perpetrator was a cisgender man. So the patterns of perpetration are also very overlapping, and engaging men and working on harmful forms of masculinity is key to preventing both those forms of violence. So we work very closely with Rainbow Health in Victoria to draft this section and to point very clearly to the opportunities for collaborative and mutually reinforcing approaches to addressing both those forms of violence, while also recognising the specific expertise of the PVAW, the Preventing Violence Against Women sector, and the LGBTQI sector, standing alone in each other's right. We have also improved the conceptualisation and the incorporation of intersectionality throughout this document. And there's a few points I want to make about that. I'm going to come back to that towards the end. But before I do that, I wanted to talk about some of the specific changes that we've made to the names and the numbering of the drivers of violence. For those of you who are familiar with Change the Story, you'll know that there are 4 clearly named and identified gendered drivers of violence against women. And these are the condoning of violence against women, so that's on an individual level, but also at a social and cultural level in a society that condones and tolerates and even encourages that violence. Men's control of decision-making and the limits to women's independence, both in public and in private life, which points to the broader gender equality agenda as being critical to actually create the kind of society that doesn't give rise to individual acts of violence against women. So the structural gender equality agenda and the individual preventing violence in relationships are not two separate things, they're intimately connected. Driver 3 is one that we have slightly changed the wording of. It's the same thing, but we've slightly changed the wording of it to focus on rigid gender stereotyping. We had this in the first edition as stereotypes, as if they just kind of exist out there and float around. But we've done a lot more in the explanation of this driver to talk about stereotyping as a process, stereotyping as something that individuals do, that schools do, that governments and workplaces do, and that there are people and agencies and organisations doing that stereotyping whose actions and practices need to change, as well as in particular all gender stereotypes being harmful, but particularly those dominant forms of masculinity that contain those kind of harmful aspects that drive violence are really key to transform. Related to that, the other slight change we've made, we previously had talked about male-peer relations as being an area that a driver of violence that needed attention. We've expanded that to talk about cultures of masculinity because we were finding that people were interpreting male-peer relationships to be blokes down the pub or blokes in the footy club. And we wanted to lift that up to talk about the cultures of masculinity that also pervade the average corporate boardroom, the average large workplace, some of those more white-collar industries, that it's not just individual blokes, it's actually a culture of masculinity that pervades Parliament House, that all of those ways in which masculinity is cultural need to be addressed, not just individual men and the way they relate to each other as mates. So we've done, and again, this is part of lifting the focus up to that structural level that I talked about at the beginning. The second change that we've made is to the explanation of the social context that gives rise to violence against women. We previously had this talked about as a reinforcing factor, which I think from the minute we published it, we knew wasn't quite the right way to do it. So we've lifted and elevated this up to talk about the way in which gender inequality and other forms of oppression, such as racism, ableism, ageism, transphobia, and so on, intersect to create the kind of cultural soup, the kind of cultural world, the environment that then gives rise to gendered violence, violence against women. Those individual acts and attitudes and behaviours don't just arise out of nowhere. They're actually embedded. They're actually a product of this entrenched culture, which includes these other intersecting forms of oppression. It's not only a gender lens that we need to understand violence against all women. So we're hoping that that is a much clearer explanation of the social context. We've made a couple of tweaks to what are called the reinforcing factors. And for those not familiar with Change the Story, we focus on the drivers of violence because they are the key things that need to change, and they are the things that in and of themselves drive violence against women. There are a range of other reinforcing factors, and these are the things that often get a lot more attention, like alcohol or poverty, or people will come up, the front page of the paper will come up with all sorts of other reinforcing factors. We're not saying they're irrelevant. Of course, work to change all of those factors is critical, but they're not the things that drive high levels and high rates of prevalence of highly gendered violence in and of themselves. So we call them reinforcing factors, and we've kept these fairly intact from the first edition. One of the ones that's changed is factors that weaken pro-social behaviour, and that does sound a bit jargony, but pro-social is basically the good version of antisocial. So pro-social behaviour is when people express care, respect, concern, empathy for others. That's pro-social behaviour, and in a gendered context, that is men expressing care and empathy and concern for women. So there are a number of factors that can weaken that. And we know that harmful use of alcohol, gambling, disadvantaged neighbourhoods, all sorts of other factors that can weaken those forms of pro-social behaviour. But for us, it's really critical not to say, therefore, alcohol equals violence or poverty equals violence. Those things have an impact on people's capacity to exhibit pro-social behaviour. And so it's really important to make that connection to us. Otherwise, it's a very victim-blaming approach, and it's very difficult to do this with nuance, so we have tried to explain that quite clearly. One of the interesting things we've added in there is natural disasters such as a pandemic, floods, fires, and so on, because again, and we saw this with COVID equals an increase in violence against women. People are stressed, therefore violence goes up. People are trapped indoors, therefore violence goes up. We would say that that is an example of kind of missing the middle part, that it's only in a context of gender inequality and unequal power relationships between men and women, harmful ideas about male control over their female partners. It's only in that context that external stresses create a spike in violence against women. It's not the pandemic causing the spike, it's the underlying conditions. So it's difficult to get that message across in a public context, and we're constantly trying to battle kind of journalists who want to simplify it. But I think it's really important when we ask questions about those kinds of factors that we explain it properly. The other thing we've talked about a lot more clearly is the way in which resistance and backlash to gender equality is actually in and of itself a reinforcing factor of that violence. And I think Tanya talked about resistance and backlash projects this morning. So the way in which the more gender equality and prevention projects are out there and the more we get traction on this issue, the more we also get resistance and backlash from people who want to turn the clock back, don't like talk about gender equality, don't like talk about the rights of trans women. We're seeing it all at the moment in terms of that backlash. And what we're wanting to identify is that that culture of backlash is in and of itself an enabler of violence, a creator of violence. It condones violence, it condones disrespect. So it has that reinforcing impact. So putting all of those things together, Change the Story identifies these 4 gender drivers of violence against women that arise in this underlying social context in which there are multiple intersecting forms of discrimination and disadvantage, as well as power and privilege, multiple intersecting forms of power and privilege. And I think too often we only talk about the other side of it. And that we have reinforcing factors that are also part of the picture. This is all on our website. If people are taking photos, you might be able to download it more easily. So what we've done more clearly in the second edition is to align the 12 actions to prevent violence against women, to make it clear that the green ones are the essential actions because they are the things that address the drivers of violence. The orange ones are also essential because they are the things that address the underlying social context. So we are not going to prevent violence against women until women are equal, until women are respected, and those are the things that address those. Until men adopt less harmful forms of masculinity and so on. So those are the essential actions that address the drivers and the social context. We then have made more clear that the blue ones are the supporting actions that will address the reinforcing factors. And, many people are working to reduce the long-term impacts of exposure to violence, for example, or to strengthen post-social behaviour, to address backlash. All of that is critical work, but on its own, it won't actually prevent violence against women. So we're trying to map that out a bit more clearly. As I said, we've made some tweaks to some of the wording of some of these actions, which people who are familiar with the first edition may want to look a little bit more closely at Action 3, where we've talked a lot more about the need to build new social norms that can foster identities that are not based on those rigid gender stereotypes, ideas of masculinity and femininity and relationships and so on, that are not based on the stereotyping practices. We've also gone into a bit more detail about the work that's needed to support men and boys to develop healthy forms of masculinities and to disrupt and transform those male peer cultures that I was talking about. We've also made some changes as we've uplifted the need to focus on intersecting forms of discrimination. We've uplifted the need for essential action to address all of the intersections between gender inequality and other forms of structural oppression. And again, as I talked about lifting up from the individual to the organisational and the structural, we've really re-emphasised the need to build organisations, not just individuals, but organisations, institutions and structures that are based on equality and that are focused on that policy and systemic level of change. Again, where I talked at probably complicated length about pro-social behaviours, we have increased the discussion about what kinds of actions are needed to address those, to strengthen those pro-social behaviours. And as I also mentioned, we've got a little bit more information on how to address, on the importance of addressing resistance and backlash to gender equality as part of this social change agenda. And I said I would come back to how we had strengthened the inclusion of issues of intersectionality in the framework, and it's difficult to do this quickly, but we've done it throughout. We've tried to integrate this a lot more clearly throughout the framework, but we've also done it in two key parts. And the first is to talk about the way an intersectional analysis is critical to understanding the problem in the first place. And that is achieved by elevating the focus on those intersecting forms of oppression and discrimination, but also intersecting forms of power and privilege, particularly in talking about men and understanding that some men have huge amounts of power and privilege, other men have very little power and privilege. You know, they may have some power over the women in their lives, but in a social context, they have very little power and privilege. So it's that nuanced and intersectional understanding of masculinity as much as it is about, you know, women's experiences. So we've made that much more central to the conceptual understanding that this is based on. And we've also tried to expand all of the explanations of how, rather than just say, oh, all these things intersect, we've tried to use examples and explanations of how sexism and racism intersect for women of colour, you know, of how ableism intersects with sexism and gender inequality for women with disabilities to drive, you know, huge levels of violence against women with disability. So we've tried to use a lot more examples to illustrate that. And then the second aspect is to not just use intersectionality to understand the problem, which I think is where a lot of people stop, but to use intersectionality to integrate intersectional approaches into our actions, into our practice, into our approaches to preventing violence. To note that prevention needs to address both the gender drivers of violence and all of those intersecting forms of oppression, discrimination, power and privilege. And in applying an intersectional feminist lens, we need to not only acknowledge those intersections, but actually aim to transform them. So our work needs to be gender transformative as well as anti-racist, as well as being allies to LGBTQI communities. So that transformative approach is absolutely critical to proper prevention. So that's a bit of a whiz through the many changes, and I'm happy to, you know, delve into any of those in more depth in the question section. But just to finish up, Change the Story is now, you know, a truly updated evidence base and a policy framework. And so it does aim at a large audience. We want practitioners to be able to use it, but we also know that it needs translation, and that's what our practice team at Our Watch does, is translate this evidence framework into a lot of more practical tools and resources for practitioners like many of you. It's also a policy framework, and that's particularly what my team focuses on, is working with state territory governments across the country to have them understand that this is a framework for funding prevention activity in their state and territory budgets, and for creating the kinds of infrastructure that are needed to support proper prevention that Tanya was talking about this morning. So we very much hope, of course, that it continues to influence Australia's national approach to primary prevention, one that does remain a world-leading approach and that we're incredibly proud to be a part of. Our Watch has been providing advice to the Commonwealth for the last few months on the development of a second national plan, and while we haven't yet seen that and don't actually know what that is going to, eventuate to be like, all of our advice has aligned with the evidence in this as some of the national experts on prevention. And as I said, we are now doing a lot of work internally to integrate this new evidence into our own work, into our new campaigns, our practitioner tools and resources. All of our media and communications work is being updated to align with this second edition. Both the framework, I've got a copy here, which is kind of my pet copy, so I won't give that away, but I've got various copies of the summary, but both of these are available on the Our Watch website for download. We've also got heaps of other tools and resources on there, all the ones that I mentioned, the masculinity framework, the Aboriginal framework are all on there. We've got a new framework called Changing the Landscape, which focuses on violence against women with disability. For those of you who haven't had a chance to try and check out some of those resources, I hugely encourage you to do that. Our Watch also has a email newsletter. If people would like to sign up, just go to the website, and that is lots of news and resources that's relevant to practitioners as well. So I will finish there. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to take questions. I don't know if somebody wants to facilitate, or shall I just... Okay.
So I have two questions. I'm really sorry. I'll keep them brief. First of all, thank you so much for the presentation. It was really informative. So you talked about the intersectional approaches to the men's violence, which I guess is something that we don't talk about as much. But obviously we know that men from, all socioeconomic backgrounds, all, different intersecting backgrounds, racial backgrounds, whatever it may be, perpetrate violence. So how deep do you go into that? And I guess on the back of that, is it more that you're going into the different reasons? Because obviously, poverty, potentially there's different reasons than, a man in a boardroom, but the end result is the same. So could you talk a little bit more about that and how that's presented?
Yeah, sure. I guess the answer is we go into that a little bit in Change the Story, but the place to find all of that in a lot more depth is Men in Focus. So that is our evidence review on the relationship between masculinity and violence against women, and what is it about particular forms of masculinity that is driving or that is contributing to violence against women. And I guess just on your earlier point, Men in Focus integrates throughout an intersectional understanding of men. So men are not this monolithic group who all have the same way of being men and the same idea of masculinity. Men are diverse and intersectional the same way that women are, and Men in Focus has quite a lot of discussion on the ways in which, some men adopt, particular forms of masculinity in a corporate boardroom, whereas other men in a community, in a footy club, adopt different forms of masculinity. Some of them may be harmful, some of them may be more respectful. Again, as I said before, many groups of men don't actually have a lot of power and privilege in our society because they experience racism or they're experiencing the impacts of colonisation. So Men in Focus very much has a lot of that discussion and heaps of resources and references on that. So that's probably where I'd point you to.
Do they kind of discuss about, I guess our attitudes to, if somebody is successfully going to be prosecuted, for example, or, brought through courts or to justice for the perpetration of violence, I'm guessing it's a lot less likely to happen to somebody with that super level of male privilege. Obviously there is always a level of male privilege, but for those people you're talking about, they might be more likely to be found guilty. So is there distinctions between, identifying that all men can do that and do that, and not only punishing the ones who have that lower level of male privilege?
Yeah, look, I think it's a really important point, and I think it's one of the limitations of work in this country and many countries about men is that it focuses on identified perpetrators of violence who have been mandated by a court to attend a perpetrator program, and it uses that cohort as representative of perpetrators of violence. But we know perpetrators of violence are also the 20-year-old upper class boy in the northern suburbs who takes his girlfriend out on a date and has non-consensual sex with her, sexually assaults her. She never reports it. He never talks about it again. That's just as much gendered violence against women as the people who have been caught up by the criminal justice system and
Because I think there is
perpetrated.
a gap, and I'm not saying that people who perpetrate should never be, but it needs to be across the board.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things our framework is trying to do, is to change people's perception of what the drivers of violence are, and to think about violence much more broadly, as including, sexual harassment in the workplace, sexual harassment on the street, and all those other forms that are actually driven by the exact same drivers of violence as other forms of violence.
Thank you. Sorry, just one more thing. Do you translate this into other languages? You said it's world kind of global now, so.
Yeah, we have just started to do that. We haven't in the past had very much funding to do that. Our Watch has had a fairly significant amount of funding in the past, but a lot of it has been for kind of campaigns and social marketing, less so for the production of sort of resources and translation. But we've partnered with some other organisations that have translated it, which I can put you onto. I know there's a Spanish translation, and often it's actually other countries that will come to us and say, can we translate your resources? We've got the funding to translate it into Spanish or whatever. Yeah, so there are some, but definitely not enough.
Lots of limited resources, I understand.
Yeah. But it's definitely something our comms and marketing team are looking at, particularly to try and make all of our resources more accessible, to have Auslan videos that explain them, to make sure they all conform to AAA disability standards, and to translate them. But I think we've got a long way to go in doing that properly. Yeah. I love a comment.
Yeah. Well, I think it's really good that you talked about the flip of the discourse and talk about and focus on the perpetrator rather than the victim, because from a woman, I run a women's health centre, and we, for 44 years, we band-aided women. We've never looked at as organisations that perpetrators, because even if you look at the media will always, Mary got bashed up, so the focus is always on the subject, and the subject of the matter in domestic and family violence are the perpetrators of violence, which we all know mainly men. And I'm not being sexist or anything, but the statistics I get pulled out on that everywhere I talk about domestic
the statistics
violence.
back you up there.
Exactly,
Yep.
the statistics are there to back us, all of us. So it's quite. It's really good to see that the focus in change the story. There was a mention for that, because it really, and it's our role also to educate people around us as organisations that work with women who are victims of domestic violence. Put the responsibility where it belongs, rather than it's the subject of the matter in domestic violence and men. I thought that was really good. I think it's refreshing to see that.
Thank you. I mean, it is part of the work that Our Watch is trying to do, is carve out a whole new field of work, which is primary prevention. And I suppose the only thing I'd stress is that we're not suggesting that the response sector that currently works with women needs to take responsibility for that work. They're already stretched and underfunded and doing an amazing job supporting women. But what we need to do is identify a whole different workforce, a new workforce, a newly funded workforce that can do primary prevention in schools, in workplaces, in local governments, in sporting clubs, in the media, so that you in the response sector can do your work and not have to shoulder this other. Yeah.
We do the work.
That's right.
It's one part of it.
Yeah.
It's one part of addressing domestic violence.
That's right. But if we don't have this other activity going on, we'll never turn off the tap for all of your services. You'll just keep getting new women walking in the door every generation. What we're trying to do is identify the work that it will take to gradually, not overnight, but gradually turn off that tap. Yeah. This one at the back over there. Mike, sorry.
Quick. Thank you so much. That was really informative, and I'm looking forward to reading it. I guess to kind of roll on this topic, but one of the things that we were talking about in our organization was the power of language, and how we, how the media and even us in organizations say, one in however many women have been a victim of domestic violence. Did you find use in potentially reframing the language? So, all of your social media say one in however many men perpetrate violence, and what would you see as the benefits or the harm in doing so?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question. It is something that we tried to do throughout this, is to use, I think violence against women is still an important phrase. It's still important to frame it that way, to focus on who is bearing the brunt of that violence. However, that can't be the only way that we talk about it. And we've tried to use interchangeable language throughout this. And where, I remember doing the edit with Shane, who worked on the Men in Focus piece, this particular edit where we went through and we worked out where could we say men's violence, like in what context were we actually talking about men's violence or men's perpetration of violence, and change those paragraphs to use that language. And in other contexts we were actually talking about, women's experiences. So we've tried to be a lot more kind of intentional about the language. I guess just to touch on your point about can we say X number of men perpetrate violence, unfortunately the answer currently is no, because the national data that is collected from a victim's experience perspective. So the Personal Safety Survey, which the ABS runs, which is what we all rely on when we say 1 in 5 women, 1 in 3 women, physical violence, sexual violence, etc., all the stats that we roll off, you'll notice they are all about 1 in X number of women has experienced, because that survey asks women what violence they've experienced and when and how many times, and it does ask them by whom, and that's how we know, that 94% identify male perpetrator, or 95, or whatever it is. What we don't have is a parallel survey, a sister brother survey, which surveys men and asks men what kinds of violence they've perpetrated or whether they've perpetrated violence. There are some example of a perpetrator study in other countries that have done that. So people think it's impossible to do because you can't ask men if they've ever perpetrated violence, but researchers have very careful and sensitive ways of collecting that data, and it has been done in other countries. There's a multi-country study that does that. So Our Watch, along with a number of other advocates, is pressing the federal government to fund a national perpetrator study, which would give us that data about what proportion of men perpetrate violence. Is it a small proportion who are perpetrating a lot of violence, or is it a lot of men who are perpetrating violence? And what do we know about those perpetrators? What do we know about their demographics, their background, the kinds of violence, and how what the correlation is between men who perpetrate particular kinds of violence and their attitudes about men, about masculinity, about women, about gender. Those are the things that would really give us the kinds of data that we could, focus in on with prevention. But at the moment, we don't have that national data. So if anyone has connections in the ABS, if you could start collecting that, it would be super helpful. It probably wouldn't tell us a lot that we don't already know in terms of the need to focus on men, but it would give us that more nuanced picture about how many, which is what you're referring to. Is there? Sorry, I couldn't see the mic. And there's a question down here if there's also a mic. Yep.
I work for Good Shepherd, so I'm much more familiar with the financial inclusion space than this space. It's really exciting, and empowering to be with you. But my question is, are there state-funded organizations who are kind of like state-based primary prevention organizations, or is it primarily like the women's refuges and women's health that kind of, or local councils is the other one I can think of. But yeah, I was just thinking who else is doing this work on the state level?
Yeah, very good question, especially in New South Wales. I'll try not to be too specific. The answer is in Victoria, yes. In Victoria, there is a statutory body which is called Respect Victoria, which has been set up purely to focus on primary prevention with separate funding to the additional and separate funding to the response sector. So Respect Victoria has only been going a few years, but they are starting to develop a state-based framework and approach to preventing violence against women and funding the kinds of prevention programs that are needed. So yes, in Victoria, but no in any other jurisdiction. And so part of the work that Our Watch does, and particularly my team in terms of policy and working with the state and territory governments, is to try and encourage other jurisdictions to fund prevention separately to response, to create additional pools of funding for the kind of prevention infrastructure, is what we call it, that we know is needed to support this. Because it shouldn't be, it doesn't make sense for it to be the burden of the response sector apart from anything else, it's a completely different set of skills that are needed and competencies, which is why Victoria has developed a capability framework for a prevention workforce, which looks quite different to the kind of capabilities you need to support victim survivors. So there is a long way to go for all of the other jurisdictions, and Our Watch certainly appreciates the work of all of the advocates and activists that are pushing other state governments in that direction. So keep doing that.
And we will continue to advocate.
Thank you.
I have a question for you, and it's one that we've been carrying for a long time. So we got our Change the Story, and we got the one for the Indigenous community, Change the Picture. And now we've got Change the Story too. And did I hear you say something about violence against women sits under the umbrella of LGBTIQ? Or I heard it wrong?
I said that they're overlapping agendas because there are a lot of women who are LGBTQI, and Our Watch is absolutely trying to prevent violence against all women, some of whom are lesbian, transgender, bisexual and queer. Yeah.
I like that clarity. Thank you very much. But I'm edging towards a big question. And my big question is, I was going to say, what the heck are you doing with cowed women?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. We've had various discussions about how to address that, and I think part of our issue is that we're trying not to use the term cold, because our approach is that the whole of the Australian community is culturally and linguistically diverse, and that we need to adopt an intersectional approach to preventing violence against all women, rather than be like, oh, cold women are over here. That's not the case. You know, the whole of the Australian community is culturally and linguistically diverse, and anybody who is doing primary prevention needs to understand the way that gender inequality intersects with racism, with colonisation for all of the people, for some of the people in the room, you know, in any room that's going to be the case. So we've tried to take that integrated approach. There are, you know, and I can hear it in your question, there are differences of opinion about whether that is appropriate or whether a called framework would be more useful. I think we haven't really landed on that yet. What we are doing is funding a number of projects that are exploring particular ways of doing prevention on the ground, not with cold women, because I think that term is not specific enough, but with the Lebanese Muslim community in Western Sydney. So we've got a project with the Lebanese Muslim Association, for example, and it makes a lot more sense to focus on a particular cultural community. We've got a project with the Fijian Women's Association in Melbourne. Makes a lot more sense to work with a particular community and talk to those communities about, well, how is masculinity imagined in your community and what are the cultural contexts in which you're working? Because that is a specific cultural context, not, you know, a range of things. So we're trying to develop lots of like locally specific approaches.
Okay,
But it's, yeah.
I totally appreciate the conundrum around cold and how other people, a lot of people don't want to be tagged as cold. But I also hear you clearly say you recognize culture.
Yes.
And
yes.
the intricacies and complexities of culture.
Yes.
That's what we're talking about. That's what we're asking for.
Yes.
But we don't have an umbrella term to hang it on except for code.
Yeah.
And so if I hear you clearly saying, I'm going to go for this group and that group and that group, I'm going to say, God help you, because you're going to be doing a lot of little projects around the countryside, right? Yeah. So are we going to have a conversation, probably under the National Action Plan, about who is falling off the traps? Who is falling through the gap? What is the gap? Because this gap has been highlighted for a very, very long time.
Yeah.
How are we dealing with this gap? Are we going to change the title code and therefore be able to work from a culture base, which everybody has a culture? I understand. There is a problem here. How are we going to get around this? That's my point.
Yeah.
Can I just add one more thing to this, just to make it a little bit more interesting? And you know how you're talking about, you've got a cohort of Lebanese women, you've got a cohort of Fijian women. What is your process, and how do you how do you pick those communities? What's your evidence? How do you do that?
I
wanted
mean,
to throw something.
yeah, no, that's okay. Look, and it's all. There's no easy answer to any of this, and our watch is kind of feeling our way in this as well. And I guess what we've had is funding for a community grants program, and we've invited applications from all kinds of communities, some culturally based and some based on other components, to apply for those grants. And Connected Communities is the project I'm talking about. And so we've assessed the grant applications according to criteria, and those are the ones that have been funded this term round. Some of them are the ones I've mentioned. This is not my area, so I've probably forgotten a whole heap, but there are some Aboriginal organisations, art shows as well, that have been funded under that. So yeah, that's essentially how they've been selected. But I guess I'm not suggesting that this is the answer is lots and lots and lots of little projects. I guess I'm just, cautioning about like an overarching approach to cold, because I don't actually know how you do that. I think you've got to be so specific about, how is culture relevant? How is it relevant to different men in different contexts? And those projects have got to be led by those communities. They've got to be developed by those communities. That's why the grant applications are like, you develop your project and your approach, submit it to us and we'll fund you and you'll develop it and we'll give support. But I think if we know anything, it is that work has to be community-led, community-developed and community-led. But I think there are a lot more conversations to be had on this. Yeah, a lot more work and a lot more funding needed, And what funding we have for this, we give it out to those communities, but it's not a lot. Yeah. Do you want? Are we going over time or? Okay. I'm happy for you to come up afterwards if you have a question.
We could have continued for easily another half an hour of discussion and questions, but we are at time. So please join me in thanking Dr. Emma Partridge.